requisite 5 minutes. Pardon me, 5 seconds. Anyway, thank you for coming. This panel will discuss Latin American art in the mid-20th century, how it has shaped and reimagined the relationship between art and its public, as well as the role of the spectator in the realization of artworks. The jumping off point for this discussion is, of course, Alexander Alberro's excellent recent book, Abstraction in Reverse, The Reconfigured Spectator in Mid-20th Century Latin American Art, which was published this year by the University of Chicago Press. In this discussion, we aimed to talk about the questions Alex deals with in his book. Among them, what was the evolving role of Latin American artists midway through the 20th century? What role did both artist and public play in the process of creating advanced artwork at that time, and how did that change the artwork? And also, to what extent did the work of certain Latin American artists, namely those involved in making the sort of concrete art, and that's a key term here, that eventually upended the relationship between the artwork and the spectator, evolve across South America and Europe? That will be the first part of our discussion, but we also hope to get into a number of other questions having to do not just with Latin American art, but with art in general. Among these are, how did a love of materialist and even positivist abstraction wind up taking a social turn that anticipated what we today call social practice? How did concrete artists conceive of a new modernist voice that transcended specific Latin American regionalisms to arrive at something that can currently be described as maybe a proto-globalization in terms of the art world? And of course, there's the perfect Art Basel Miami Beach question. Why does Latin American art matter more to international audiences today than it did in the past? We hope to deal with these questions and more than a few from you, the audience, after a quick 30 or so minutes of conversation are up. But first, let me introduce the two panelists who are here with me. First up, Alexander Alberro. Alexander Alberro is the Virginia Wright Professor of Art History at Barnard College and Columbia University in New York. Along with Abstraction in Reverse, The Reconfigured Spectator in Mid-20th Century Latin American Art, he is the author and editor of Conceptual Art and the Politics of Publicity from MIT. Also, Working Conditions, the writings of Hans Hake, also from MIT Press, Institutional Critique, and Art After Conceptual Art, both of those also from MIT Press, among many other volumes. He has also published in a broad array of journals and exhibition catalogs. His book, which I think is somewhere around here, is this one. This is what we're discussing. A little bit of show and tell. We also have with us today Kaira Cabañas. Kaira is an associate professor in global modern and contemporary art history at the University of Florida, Gainesville. She is the author of The Myth of Nouveau Realism, Art and the Performative in Post-War France, and Off-Screen Cinema, Isidore Issou and the Lettrist Avant-Garde. In 2012, she co-curated and edited the catalog for the exhibition Spectres of Artaud, Language and the Arts in the 1950s at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid. Her writings have appeared in a wide range of scholarly journals and museum catalogs and include essays on post-war art and film in Europe and Latin America. She is currently completing the book-length study, Learning from Madness, Brazilian Modernism and Global Contemporary Art, which was supported by the Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant Program and is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. She's also a regular contributor to Art Forum. So let's get moving, Alex. I think you have some slides that you sort of want to run us through by way of explicating the thesis of your book, Abstraction in Reverse, and in talking about the sort of inversion of values with regards to that took place with regards to European abstract art in Latin America, right, in the mid-20th century. Let's see how that inversion happens and sort of how and where.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. We had discussed in advance that it would probably be a good idea that I give you the elevator discussion of the book, namely, let me just tell you in 4 or 5 minutes what the central arguments are, and then we're all in the same discussion. Some of us who have read the book and some who haven't. So one of the things I argue in this book, one of the central things that I argue is that during the mid-20th century, and by the way, before I go on, I can't control the slides from up here, so I'm going to be putting my arm up to change the slides. So it's not a nervous twitch; it's a signal that to get the gentleman in the back to help me to move the slides forward. So not yet. I was just showing them what I was going to do. So I argue that during the mid-20th century, Latin American artists reimagined the relationship between art and its public. And in the process, they granted the spectator a more significant role than ever before in the actual making of the artwork. I explain that these developments unfolded in the context of a complicated mediation of the particular form of abstract art that European modernist artists such as Theo van Doesburg, Piet Mondrian, Max Bill, and others referred to as concrete art. So there's a mediation of this type of art that's known as concrete art. But then I go on to show that Latin American artists would soon push the logic of concrete art considerably beyond the boundaries that the Europeans had constructed for it. Indeed, most of the artists whose work is central to abstraction in reverse created their distinctive identities precisely by rejecting the predetermined generalizations of pictorial and sculptural concretism and offering alternatives to it. In their effort to imagine art as an integral aspect of an intellectual and sensual life that responded to their own particular concerns, they put aside the concretist notion that the meaning of an artwork is established before or prior to its experience by the spectator, in favor now of a concept that assumes that meaning can be produced only in the site where the art object and the spectator meet, where the subject and the object come together. In the book, I call the site of this intersection the aesthetic field, and the aesthetic field of the artwork's aesthetic field, and argue that by reshaping the aesthetic field to conceive of the spectator not just as a pair of eyes, but now also as an active and sensual being engaged in a new kind of attentiveness and a new kind of tactile encounter that involve not only the intellect but also the senses, post-concrete artists opened the way for new modes of consciousness and new modes of experience, as well as new models of subject-object relations. Now, I started this book with a very simple question, namely, what did it take for an artist? Let's take Jesus Soto as an example, although I talk about several instances that are very similar. But let's use Soto as an example. What did it take for an artist such as Soto to go from producing fairly conventional paintings, such as this one here from 1949-1950, to canvases such as serial composition of just a couple of years later, and then just 2 years after that to projects where artworks such as Spiral, which literally come off the wall, come into the space of the spectator. I mean, this is at least a foot into the room of the spectator. And then the Vibration series of the late 1950s, which are also coming forward into the space of the spectator. And then finally, by the 1960s, the famous Penetrables. What was the logic what was the pictorial logic of that transition, that dramatic transition from fairly conventional landscape painting to artworks like this within a period of a decade and a half? And as I said, my book focuses on several artists who made very similar transitions in these very same years. The central thesis of the book the central argument of the book, in brief, is that in breaking in various ways with the core dictums of concrete art, Latin American artists in the mid-20th century reimagined the relationship of art to its public and produced artworks that challenged the prevailing notions of the interconnection between the human subject and the world, between the objective reality and the subjective experience. And in this new conceptualization, art was no longer considered entirely autonomous and internally coherent, but relationally dynamic, prompting the imaginative engagement and creativity of the spectator in the realization of the artwork and producing meaning through this very relationality.
Okay, I'm going to follow up. I'd like to first congratulate Alex on the publication, which is a great scholarly achievement and a real contribution to the field of the study of Latin American art in the mid-20th century in particular. And wanted to take up on the final phrase in terms of, this positing of a new relationality between the artwork and the spectator, and perhaps ask you to respond to what is it about the present or our contemporary moment that kind of casts in relief this moment in mid-20th century art in Latin America and makes it more legible to us now, but also the inverse of that. What is it about that art that also perhaps shifts our understanding of the present?
That's interesting. So why does this art resonate in the present? I mean, first of all, we have to agree that it does. And we can agree that it does because of the attention that this Latin American art, I mean, the panel before this one was Pacific Standard Time panel, which focused on a lot of art, like the work that I discuss in the book from Latin America. But what was it about Latin American art or what is it about Latin American art that resonates today? And, one of the things that, one of the central concerns of the study that I develop maintains that that abstraction in reverse is where things no longer go into the negative but come out into the positive, come into the space of the spectator. So abstraction is removing and removing from space, and the reverse of that is where the artwork now starts to come into the space that it shares with the spectator. Is that clear? So one of the things that I think that has led this type of work to become so interesting for so many people in the last 15 or so years is that a lot of contemporary art is immersive in that way. It comes into the space of the spectator, whether it's installation art or it's light art, the James Turrell, or the art that projects into your space. It envelopes the spectator. And with that phenomenon, within the context of a global contemporary art, we're not necessarily talking about a Latin American art here, we're talking about the kind of global art that one sees even in the fair here, with the phenomenon of the artwork coming into the space of the spectator, there seemed to have been a need for an analysis of what might have led to that phenomenon, because the northern model of art, the North American European model, didn't have a language it didn't have the pictorial language to explain that phenomenon of moving into a space that the artwork shares with the spectator, and to touch on the various senses of the spectator beyond just the visual sense. One of the things that a lot of the work that I focus on in this particular project does is it maneuvers more than just the visual sense of the spectator. One feels the work. If you're in a room that is colored by light, you're first of all, you're part of the work because you enter into the work in order to share it, to experience it. But also, it starts to touch your skin, essentially. It starts to affect the tactile sense. And in some of the cases at hand, there would even be smells that were incorporated into the work. Helioidicicus tropicalia, for instance, or in some of Ligia Pape's work, you would taste the work. It was a mobilization of the senses. And then I found that mobilization of the prehistory of that mobilization of the senses that has become so prevalent in the last couple of decades of contemporary art exists within the context of these Latin American artists. At least that's one of the central claims that I make, and I try to explain that in the book.
So, I mean, the immediate question that comes to mind for me is why does that exist in Latin American art in the mid-20th century and not up north? I mean, what are the geopolitics of this in a certain sense? Well, what's the missing element, either there or here, that allows for the development of those extrasensorial sort of reaches, you know, and why, from our contemporary point of view, is our particular version, you know, impoverished?
I mean, this is a question that I think if we asked everyone in this room, everybody would have a slightly different answer to that question.
Yeah, but it's in your book,
but let me try it. Yeah. You know, part of the easy solution would be to say that the northern models were Calvinist and did not share the senses. They were purely visually based. It was a regime of visual aesthetics that we get from Immanuel Kant on through 200 years into the present, which was purely vision-based. But that's too easy, right? I mean, one of the ways to approach something like that, especially since, if you want to speak about Calvinism, Mondrian was about as Calvinist as you get. I mean, this is somebody who, wouldn't put a plant in his, he was phobic of green because green connoted organic life. Green connoted life. What's interesting is that many of these artists within the context of Latin America were fascinated by Mondrian. And so how do you get to the senses from the work of somebody who was absolutely non-sensual, shall we say, at least within the context of the Mondrian works? And I think we all know what those Mondrian, I'm talking about the primary colors on a balance. Well, part of it is a misunderstanding. I mean, the way that they misunderstood Mondrian, I do quite a bit with that. Namely, they had an interpretation of Mondrian which was quite different from the interpretation of Mondrian that somebody like, say, Donald Judd had, or these other people that we could mention. For them, Mondrian was a sensual artist. Most of the artists, what's fascinating is going through the archives and reading about when, say, Soto, who I just discussed, first actually sees a Mondrian painting, right? I mean, you have to keep in mind that these artists are fascinated, the artists that working out of Latin America are fascinated by figures like Mondrian or Malevich, but they've never seen a Mondrian or a Malevich until they travel. And what's fascinating about Soto, for instance, is just how, through his memoirs, he's noticing just how wrong he had it, how he had completely imagined a very different painting. For instance, he didn't know that you could see a brushstroke in a Mondrian, and he thought the lines would go all the way to the end, and he didn't, even the colors were imagined.
The devil's in the details every
Because,
time, right?
Yeah, well, the devil's in the actual artwork, right? So keeping in mind that, quite often what these artists would see would be even Mondrian in black and white. I mean, Lidi Prati, as people like Ariel Isaacs, who's here, told me, and Raul Naon, Lidi Prati painted the red onto the black and white images of the Mondrians to kind of show where the colors were, because they weren't color, they didn't have access to color images. So part of what happens is a reimagination of what was going on in the trajectory of Mondrian, say, or the trajectory of Malevich, who's also a very important figure in this context. And that reimagination leads to an inclusion of the senses.
Following up on that, I wonder if there's something about the distinction between the abstract and the concrete that also kind of enables a different type of condition in which you go from the material constituents of painting to the real world in a way that the logic of abstraction, as the artists across these various sites understood it, maybe doesn't allow. And maybe you could speak a little bit to this distinction between, why the concrete versus the abstract.
Yeah, no, that's good. Let me just go back to the distinction between abstract and concrete. Abstraction is a negation of figuration. You are removing the last traces of the figurative. So that, for instance, Picasso never produced a completely abstract painting. There was always a trace of the figure, somewhere or other. And Matisse as well. I mean, the abstraction is also a 20th century invention, right? This is something that obviously we know that 500 years ago people could have painted a monochrome a white square on a white square, but they didn't, right? So it's something that needed to, for whatever reason, it's something that was able to happen in this century. So abstraction is the negation of figurative content. Concrete is then what happens when you get to zero and you start to produce. So concrete is the production of a production of something that comes into space. I think I explained that earlier. Now, if the work is coming into space, then the spectator is engaging with the work through their body. One is moving around in the space with the work. If the work is now in the space that you share with it, then the senses become involved because the work is in your space, and you're negotiating that particular realm with this object, and hence a lot of concrete art would require the spectator to produce its own its own logic. I mean, one of the things about concrete art, though, is, let me try to give you an example. Maybe I should have shown another good Latin American example of concrete art. I mean, concrete art takes up, for instance, serial music. With serial music, we're talking about like music by Stockhausen or Boulez. It's beyond abstract, where you're now producing algorithms. You're producing serials. You're producing patterns that are after the abstract, but they're patterns that then start to generate their own algorithm. And so they start to construct something beyond the abstract. It starts to come into the space. Anyway, the short answer is that in the artwork coming into the space of the spectator, the senses, the phenomenological dimension of the senses become involved. And it's interesting that something like, since I just mentioned the term phenomenology, the works of philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of, his various texts on phenomenology actually were translated into Portuguese, into Spanish, and before they were translated into English. So that the people are reading this in Portuguese, say, in the 1950s, or in Spanish before
Robert Morris.
Before Robert Morris and the minimalists in the
Right.
It was translated into English in 1964, I think, or 62. So it's a much later reception that this has.
Yeah, these cultural histories are super important. I mean, the what's gained in translation, also what's lost in translation. You referred previously to certain kind of, misunderstandings, which we might be able to call creative misunderstandings. But the part that I'm sort of still interested in is the distinction, sort of the geocultural distinctions between North and South, and what I mean, not in a deterministic way, obviously, and you explain it in your book, when you talk about certain asynchronous developments in Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela and on, in which modernity isn't exactly sort of jigsaw puzzled in properly in each of these sort of cultural contexts. So the artist reactions or the artist adaptations of the concrete model, the abstract model, they don't founder, they develop differently. Is that fair to say?
Because why?
Well, again, not in a deterministic way, but there's a different geocultural lay of the land, right? Socioeconomic lay of the land. The modernity isn't quite as properly well established as it is in Northern Europe and in the United States.
I mean,
so
look,
the abstraction is going to develop differently.
Again, I mean, there are people in this room that have much more knowledge about this than I do, but the art world, I start the book in Buenos Aires and in Montevideo. It must have been very small. I mean, we're talking about at most 100 people, right? I mean, it's like, who is Thomas Maldonado painting for in 1944, or Lidi Prati? 200 people? I mean, it's nothing like what, and 200 people who aren't understanding what they're doing, right? I mean, it's not like they had a reception and people said, this is great. I mean, it's definitely completely different from anything that they're familiar with within that context. But, so, I think that the lack of an easy understanding leads to, the lack of immediate recognition leads to greater experimentation. Maybe that's too much of a universal, but if you really have to figure out how to do it because what you've done is not getting an audience or public, then you have to kind of constantly be reworking it, and in a context where there really wasn't much of a public for that kind of work. It's the same thing with the concrete artists in Brazil in the 1950s. I mean, there were a few figures. There was always a few enlightened collectors that were, supporting the work. But essentially, they were discussions between artists, and hence, you have achronicity, or the times aren't matching up in development because every context is developing in its own with its own public, with its own logic. So you have these asynchronous pockets that only later, when you have a historian or a curator or a critic, only later can one come back and say, well, look, there might have been some pattern going on here, even though...
And I think it's a good time to jump to just those kinds of issues, those kinds of questions.
Right. I mean, this was something we spoke about or touched on
Right.
last week in conversation, which has to do with a certain asynchronicity in terms of the reception of art from Latin America and the United States, and that it's really been curators and museum exhibitions that have enabled a certain legibility, and there's been this kind of deferral or lag in terms of academia, right? And so I was wondering, not that you have to account for that lag, but more what were some of the exhibitions or curators, shows that you turned to or thought about or encountered in the research towards your book?
And I'm actually interested to figure out what accounts for that lag.
I've thought a lot about
why
that.
50 years?
Sure.
Why 50 years plus till we can basically sort of write this history? I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
There are two questions. I mean, the why 50 years why 50 years, I kind of touched on a little bit
From the
earlier.
perspective of the United States, I'm not saying that other histories haven't been written in other places.
Yes,
I'm talking
yes,
about
absolutely.
U.S. academic culture.
There's something about the art that's produced by Latin American artists in the mid-20th century that resonates with contemporary art, and I think that's why 50 years there's been an increased interest in that work because of its Number one, because of the growing importance of growing attention that contemporary art gets, and number two, because contemporary art is relating to works by some of these figures in quite a big way. But to come back to the first question, which is why, if I understand it, why curators and critics were there first before scholars, art historians and scholars, which I think is a completely legitimate question. In other words, this is still, I don't know, maybe there are, but it's only now that you're starting to see books like Abstraction and Reverse being written, which are telling a history about a mid-20th-century history, I might add. It's not a history of just yesterday, it's a history of events, things that happened and transpired quite a while ago. So why were the curators there first? And it is true that they were. My first encounter with some of this work was through exhibitions, when I first saw, Catherine David's exhibition on Clark, or Manolo Borja-Biel's exhibition on Oiticica, and you start to see through the various things that happen here in the U.S. as well. One of the things that curators can do is to go out to the field and put together a show. To go out, survey the field, talk to artists, collectors, and organize an exhibition. This book took me 12 years to write. I don't think a curator can invest 12 years in a show. In a way, there's a greater depth that's required, but completely indebted to what the curators and critics have done. And there were, Guy Brett was writing about this work in the 1960s, and Ferrero. There are plenty of critics that were involved. But to actually construct the kind of history that I've attempted to construct, this is concerted effort of a decade at least, which takes a bit longer than putting together an exhibition. What are the curators? Maybe the curators in the room think that no, in fact, one is always thinking about the exhibition. Even before you go to put it together, there's thought that's going into the production of that show, so we should be taking that thought process into account. But anyway, that would be my short answer, namely that it takes a bit longer to put something like this together.
But I think it's fair to say in that case that both of you guys, you with Learning from Madness now, you're in the middle of this, you're essentially writing the histories because they haven't been properly written yet. You're joining the dots in any event.
Yeah, Kaira's just written this fabulous book on Brazilian artists in the 1940s. Why don't you tell us something about the book on Pedrosa?
Sure. My book, I'll also talk about it in terms of how it intersects with abstraction and reverse, but it's a very different topic. I trace the relation between art and psychiatry, and more specifically the reception of psychiatric patients' work and how that's very constitutive of modernism's self-fashioning in Brazil, and how that is very distinct from the way modernism develops in North America. So if you put somebody like, critic Clement Greenberg next to Mario Pedrosa, you already have two different conceptions of what modern art is, given that Pedrosa was also writing reviews of psychiatric patients' art. And so that has certain effects for how modernism is institutionalized in terms of the various exhibitions of psychiatric patients' work. And the arc of the book is really, it begins in the 1920s in Sao Paulo and ends with the current trend towards including outsider artists in the global contemporary circuit, problematizing that inclusion as well. And so that's the larger arc.
What about the social turn in that seems to be sort of that the Latin American abstraction that you write about seems to be pregnant with?
You're pushing me here because I'm not totally sure that there is a social turn in, the book ends in the 1960s, and but let me go with this a bit. I mean, one of the central notions that I attempt to develop is that the art of and try not to be too academic here, but the art that's made by these Latin American artists who I study was humanist. And humanist in the sense of a belief that the kind of production that they were making wasn't for a particular public, it was for anybody could see it. And it's like, I think Mondrian as a humanist. I mean, the idea is like everybody at any given time is going to relate to this work in the way that the artists might have intended that relation to be. Okay, but however, the social turn happens where a little bit after, I would argue, where probably in the 1970s, which is beyond the scope of the book, really. I end the last chapter.
You kind of end there.
Conclusion is there.
You end
the
at
social
turn.
turn is where you're no longer imagining this humanist, universal subject. You're imagining that you're speaking to particular people who have particular issues that they want to deal with and that they want to engage with, and so you're addressing the particulars instead of the more generals. I think a lot of the artists, if you think of the Sotos that I showed you, I mean, they were meant for anybody and everybody. They weren't meant for a particular context. You know, so in talking to some of these people, I mean, when I talk to, say, Julio Leparc, he says he's not a Latin American artist, he's an artist. I mean, in a way that they think that if they get called Latin American artists, which I do in the book repeatedly, it really makes it sound like they're speaking to a Latin American public. Whereas, I mean, that's one of the issues of contemporary art too. Of course, how many times have I heard artists around the world say to me that they don't want to be identified as an Egyptian artist or as a Singaporean artist. They want to be seen as an artist because people in the U.S. and in Europe don't have to identify as an American artist. They're the artists, right? So, to a certain extent, that's what was going on here, and the social begins where you actually identify who you're dealing with, where identity starts to play a greater role, where you're saying, I'm a feminist artist, or I'm a anarchist artist, or I'm a socially engaged environmentalist artist. And by doing that, you're producing a social sphere. I don't think these artists really were. It'd be the short answer. That's why I said, if you're kind of, Well, what do you think? I mean, you read the book.
Yes. I think, in fact, I think you pointed the way at the very end of the book. You seem to make the connection very clearly between Clark and Oitichica and Mireles and Jacoby, and they're going into structural kinds of critiques, right? And they, according to your book, seem to be moving directly from this larger sort of participative, super phenomenological sort of immersion that, as you just put it, doesn't demand, at least from the point of view of Mireles and Oitichica and Clark, doesn't demand a great deal of theory reading or the idea is that anyone can basically come in and participate in this stuff and not have the spectatorship is really sort of it's front and center, and from there to get to social critique is like a half step maybe, right?
Yeah.
We've been asked to sort of wrap up quickly, but I do want to sort of mention one thing. In our previous conversation, I think it was you, Kaira, that was talking about how supranational all of these efforts were, on the part of these artists. And I think one of you said something about most of your book, and most of the narrative of those artists took place in Paris, kind of in the same way that Anglo-American literature, had Paris as an American city, right? So I wonder if you might not say a couple of things about that.
I mean, I've already had somebody send me an email asking me how I could call Paris a Latin American city in the 1950s. But, if you look at the number of Latin American artists that were operating in Paris at that time, and in the early 1960s, it's a phenomenal amount. Probably more than at least, I don't want to talk about more or less, but it was very much a movement that, and Paris at that time was still the magnet for artists from the context of Latin America. That shifts in the 1960s, as you know, to New York. But
I think part of that is this idea that the artists are in constant migration and they're in conversation, both real and imaginary, with what's going on in Europe. And that I think one of the achievements of Alex's book is to kind of insist on those transnational conversations rather than just repatriate the artists as if they're just working in Brazil, right? Or just working in Venezuela. I mean, we know that these artists are traveling, they're in conversations, and that this is important to keep in mind. I think in part to resist a kind of exclusively identitarian, your book is not identitarian, discussion of the art, right? These are artists who very much claimed a strategic universalism as a way of embracing modernity in this humanist way that you were articulating before, so.
Kind of like in our time, Miami is the northernmost capital of Latin America. Anyway, let's maybe take some questions. Please, thank you.
Hi. I have a question about extending what you were saying on the issue of the turn from geometric abstraction into what happened more with conceptual art and new concrete artists. And the question is around the issue of when this geometric abstraction became more of a formalism. Mm-hmm. And at around the 70s, because I grew up in Argentina, being a young artist there, and we were really allergic to geometric abstraction for very few reasons. First of all, because it had become the quintessential corporate art. It was bought by corporations, and it was basically made for corporations, as we interpret it. But also it was embraced by the military dictatorship. And this has nothing to do with the intentions or the content of the art, but basically because the militaries didn't want to see any figures there, because it may lead to some kind of Marxist argument that will mobilize the, function probably as propaganda against their rule. I wonder if you could speculate more on how is it that happened, because there was a split between the geometric artists that were the officialist artists of the dictatorship, and then the conceptual artists that were doing political art. And I don't know if it was a parallel between that and the emergence of the neo-concrete artists in Brazil.
No, it's an interesting question. Of course, you're asking me about a book that I didn't write, namely the 1970s and 80s, but that's fine. We can do this. Earlier we talked about misreadings, and when it comes to art, there are only misreadings, right? So because the dictatorship can misread this work the way that they did, doesn't, it's a creative misreading on the part of the dictatorship, The truth of the matter is that people like Oiticica had to go into exile, or Ligia Clark, or these people had to leave because of their work. So if that kind of work can later be spun into a kind of anodyne work that a dictatorship can appropriate, that was their reading, and so then it's a battle of interpretation. I mean, one of the things I discovered in the 1940s with the Buenos Aires, since you're talking about Argentina, is that people like Maldonado and Edward, his brother Bailey, and others, they were in the Communist Party. So they were thinking that they were making a universal art. And of course, the Communist Party wanted nothing to do with it. They kicked them out. But in other words, it's all about, that's a great thing about art, but it's also the horrible thing about art. It could be misread in any which way. It's a great thing. I actually think it's positive, right? And then it's our role as curators, as artists, as historians, critics, to kind of make an account of what it meant, so that the dictatorship might, since we're talking about the dictatorship in this context, the dictatorship might make claims for the painting, but I can show, well, actually, truth is that that's not exactly what was going on. Your interpretation, you're entitled to your interpretation. You should treasure your subjectivity, but, in fact, this was operating in a very different way than the way that you've interpreted it. So I don't know what that does. Meaning is always open for negotiation. That's a wonderful thing about art, is what it means can never be closed as certain. Never say exactly what it means, and therefore we don't need to discuss this anymore. Meaning is always in flux.
Alex, I was hearing to you about humanism and universalism of this Latin American concrete artist. I came also from Argentina, and I just want to know your thoughts, because Tomás Maldonado abandoned art, thinking that art was not the way to achieve this universalism of what they are. So he goes to design. He goes first as professor and then as director of Gestalt to Juliet of Ulm. So there he thinks he arrived to reach what they want. What do you think about that position regarding the other artists that, so design, art?
Well, it comes back to the social question that was asked earlier by Christian. If the paintings aren't communicating, artists want to do certain things, and I'm sorry, I know that there are artists in the room, and I don't want to talk about what artists want to do, but one thing that they definitely want to do is not do something that others have done before. Can we say, generally, one thing artists don't want to do is what somebody's done before, unless you're, Sherry Levine or something, where you're appropriating literally. But it's a kind of, you want to do something new, and but another thing is you want your work to have some kind of impact on the public that's experiencing it. There, I'm not so certain, but I'm pretty certain that I would make that argument. And so somebody like Maldonado is very interesting. He's making these abstract works. If you read what they're writing, they're thinking that these works are going to change the world. It's amazing that you got these 23-year-old kids, essentially, or people, who are writing these manifestos about how their work is going to produce a completely new world. And then when it doesn't happen, it's okay, well, we're getting to 30 years old now. We better, we better think of something else. And they go to design and architecture. It's not by accident that he goes on to the Bauhaus, the new Bauhaus in Ulm, where, through design and through architecture, and through ways of living, you can change people's way of living. It's part of the logical trajectory. A monograph on Maldonado would have to look like that. That, once the people weren't ready for what the art had, the paintings had to communicate, they went on to design and architecture and the Bauhaus, essentially. That's where I would go with that, I think, speaking of Maldonado. That many other artists would be the same thing, though. There's still, some of these artists are still alive, like Carlos Cruz Diaz. He's working in space through light. I presume many of us are familiar with that kind of work, or Julio Leparc, where the whole room, so therefore the social environment, or at least the spatial environment, becomes part of the work. Soto's Penetrable is the same. Christian?
Questions? Any more questions? Right there.
I wanted to ask the three of you as critics and curators and journalists and writers, have either or any of you ever painted yourselves or taken art classes in painting or...
Is this a trick question?
No, I always wonder this about critics.
Yeah, there's
and
no right
curators.
answer. Yes, it is a trick question.
Yeah, well, I always wonder that about curators and critics, if they ever, or if they continue, if they did it when they were younger, if they still continue to attempt to paint or draw or get into the mind of the artist physically by kind of immersing yourself on that side of the spectrum.
And we have no more time for questions. No, I'm just joking. Please, the both of you go first.
No, I mean, in the art history curriculum required basic training in how to make objects, basic training in the studio. So, I mean, if you're asking me if I know what cross-hatching is, for instance, or yes, it's part of the training. Did I ever think that that's something that I would do? No. I mean, how about somebody else or maybe others?
I mean, like Alex, I took art classes as part of my undergraduate program, but in terms of thinking like an artist, I mean, I'm in constant conversation with artists about their work and giving my opinion many times, and so it is part of something that I do. It's not that I have a totally like abstract relation and don't know any artists and keep them out of my life or anything like that. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I think like both of you guys and most people who write about art or study art, you regularly step in front of a work of art and try and figure out how it's made. That's one of the reactions that you have, right? But personally, I got into this line of work, as it were, out of straight envy, because I can't draw a stick figure. So that's my end of it. And at some point, yeah, I actually would like to take a painting class, as ridiculous as that sounds. But yeah, that's me. Anyway, listen, so I believe our time is up. Thank you. So I was being waved, but I think, sorry, we just got the time. Yeah. Grand. Yes, please.
I think that African art passes in much of these discussions as a spectral force, often not acknowledged, either by sometimes artists who are aware of the colonial implications of borrowing from Africa, and also from writers, historians, and critics. And I think there needs to be more attention paid to this incredible union that the African artists achieved between what has been called here abstraction and concrete thinking, feeling, and the presence of the community always in ceremonial and ritual spirituality that is achieved through holding, manipulating, wearing the human quality of the art.
I think you're right.
And I'd really like to see more of it. It's, you said Paris was the city of Latins, and well, African art was there in the 20s, 30s, 40s. They all knew about it. There are thousands of books now in English, French, German, Spanish. So they had access to this, and sometimes they didn't even know that incredible spirituality that came through in that later work was influenced by Africa.
I think certainly in Brazil, that you're absolutely right. The legacy, the Afro-Brazilian legacy is enormous.
Yeah.
So I agree, and that would be the next place to take this. I mean, to try to use the Atlantic here, not as South America to Europe, but also the Africa to South America and back. Absolutely. I think that's the next step. Look, the field was there were little bits of things that had been done, research that had been done. I mean, the way I see this book is an attempt to produce a narrative that other people will then go on and do exactly what you're already suggesting. Like, this could be focused on more. And I think that that's productive. In a way, I see this as a kind of baseline where from here, it could be challenged and developed further. And there's so many places to go. But I thought that this was necessary to at least look, these things happen and this is what we know thus far, and let's start the discussion going. Because it's a very rich discussion that can still be had, as you're already beginning to suggest.
And with that, Alex, Kaira, thank you very much. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Art Basel. Thank you, Mary Spirito.